Hello, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. We will start in around 1 or 2 minutes just to give some people that are coming late and running now to this room. So give us 1 or 2 minutes and then we'll start. So I think we can start because I will do a brief introduction. So welcome to our webinar. This is the 5th of a 6-part series on human rights and environmental due diligence in public procurement. This event series is brought to you by Electronics Watch, IndustriALL Fair Trade Advocacy Center, as well as the Rethinking Value Chains Network, with the financial support of the Charles Leopold Meyer Foundation for the Progress of Humankind. My name is Peter Pawlicki. I am Director of Outreach and Education at Electronics Watch. Electronics Watch is an independent organization that manages supply chain monitoring and industry engagement for public buyers. We are focusing on labor rights and occupational health and safety in electronic supply chains. Today, I have the pleasure to present this session with Elena Lunder of FTAO. Before we start, I would like to give you some technical comments, and for this I have to switch back to sharing my screen so you can actually see what I'm talking about. Presenters will be speaking in English and Spanish, and there is actually an option that you can get interpretation. So if you look at your Zoom window at the bottom, potentially there is a symbol with a globe on, and if you want to have all the webinar in English, click English. If you want to have all the webinar in French, click French, and if you want all the webinar in Spanish, click Spanish. If you have technical problems, please look at the chat window and do contact Martina Hooper or Electronics Watch just by clicking on it on this name, and then you can have a private chat and send her a message. As you might have seen, this session is being recorded and will be available on the Electronics Watch website after the event. This is already for the other 4 events. We have them already on our website. So if you want to watch these and you haven't had the time to participate, just go on the website and you will find them. We will have some time, we don't know yet how much, but there will be some time for Q&A at the end. Again, if you have a question already during the presentations and interviews and discussions, please do write them in the chat. And please do write them also again to Electronics Watch or Martina Hooper in the chat. As I mentioned, this is the 5th part of a 6-part series. What did we do in the first 4 parts? In the first, we discussed transparency in supply chain, which is actually the most fundamental step in due diligence. The second part focused on verification. So how to measure and verify effective due diligence. In the third webinar, we moved to questions of enforcement of due diligence in supply chains. The last part looked at questions of remedy and how to get to effective remedy systems. And today we want to focus on purchasing practices and due diligence. For that, we'll be talking with representatives from the Global South and the Global North. We will introduce our panelists directly before we speak with them or they present. Purchasing practices are central as they are setting up the structural forces that drive violations and risk in supply chains. They can enable due diligence and they can, if they are set up right, purchasing practices can make remediation effective. Low prices and fast deliveries can cause unintended consequences for workers, smallholder farmers, and environments who must absorb the true cost of production. We think that purchasing practices should be an integral element of human rights and environmental due diligence, and this is true for both private and public buyers. For a deeper and broader introduction in the area of purchasing practices, I would like to turn to Elena. Elena, hi, welcome. You will give us a bit of a broader insight into this issue. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. So as you said, I will continue the introduction into the topic, but then we will also have our speakers later on diving deeper into different aspects of how this is important. And you already touched upon the most important parts. We came to focus on this topic at the Fair Trade Advocacy Office from starting to work on the human rights and environmental due diligence as a concept a few years ago, before the European Commission committed to legislating on this, and then made a proposal in February. And we looked at how this due diligence process could have, or how it needs to be structured to have positive impacts on rights holders in global value chains, such as workers, smallholder farmers, and artisans. And one of the most important parts that we noticed was a change in purchasing practices, because, as you say, they can have profound impacts on the ability of different actors in global value chains to adopt principles of due diligence and to follow up with mitigation and adaptation and remediation and other steps. We dove a little bit deeper into what that would mean for due diligence, and later on, comparing with public procurement processes, we noticed that there's a connection there as well. So within the due diligence process, we can already see that a large portion of producers globally receive prices below the cost of production and accept short lead times and other unfavorable terms, which is due to asymmetrical power relations, and among other reasons, but this is a prominent one, that often disable different actors in a weaker position in global value chains to negotiate, to have the bargaining power with their buyers to negotiate different terms in their contracts. So this can lead to adverse impacts on human rights. And for example, a research made by ILO in 2017 found that between 40 and 50% of suppliers that they interviewed surveyed for the research, depending on the sector, receive prices below the cost of production. And the study also found a significant correlation with lower wages. As a result. Other such practices that they mentioned, that they looked at for correlation in the study, was expected flexibility from suppliers that had a negative impact, or very inaccurate technical specifications in the contracts that had a strong impact on the hourly wages of workers. This is a very particular aspect, but the same is true when it comes to smallholder farmers or artisans acting in a self-employed capacity. Inadequate prices and other terms make it impossible for them to produce sustainably, and just increasing the expectations in terms of sustainability performance would really place a higher burden without offering the right environment for those to be fulfilled. So And this has been seen also by the OECD in existing implementation of due diligence in mineral supply chains, where a tendency has been confirmed of companies passing on costs of due diligence to actors in a weaker position in their value chains. So we see that there is a strong role by public and private buyers in assessing their ability to both have a negative and positive influence on the ability of their suppliers to follow up with the diligence, especially since it's often seen as something that can be included in codes of conduct or contract clauses and then cascaded further down the chain. So we would like to look deeper into what that means when it comes to public buyers and their role vis-a-vis their suppliers, and what terms and conditions do public buyers need to offer to their business partners or to their suppliers to enable such good behavior or to incentivize such good behavior. So yeah, I'm looking forward to hear from our speakers about both good examples and what is needed from the side of rights holders.
Thank you, Elena, for this deep dive here in this issue. Our first speaker now is Jesus Rea Campos from Bolivia. Jesus is an economist who has worked in social development institutions and civil society organizations since 2002 on areas like municipal management, public policy, and development planning, as well as towards strengthening organization in artisanal and small-scale mining and mining institutions. And he has also put a focus on economic inclusion and empowerment of women miners in their communities. Welcome, Jesus. You are the Executive Director of the Center for Research and Popular Services, or CICEP, in Oruro, in Bolivia. Can you tell us a bit about CICEP so we know what your organization is working on?
Buenos días a todos los que están en este webinario y gracias a Electronic Watch por permitirme poder comentar un poco lo que hacemos en Bolivia y también comentarles el contexto de la realidad de la minería de pequeña escala en Bolivia, ¿no? Bueno, el CICEP es una institución de la Iglesia Católica, de la Compañía de Jesús específicamente, que ha sido fundada en el año 84 como una consecuencia de los procesos de, aquí llamamos relocalización, pero por esos tiempos hubo un proceso de baja de precios minerales que ha expulsado a 50.000 personas de la minería, ¿no? Entonces, fruto de ese proceso, el Estado quería privatizar las operaciones mineras en Bolivia y hubo un movimiento para evitar que capitales externos entren con alta tecnología y concentrar eso a través de una mayor flexibilización laboral. Creo que estoy yendo muy rápido, ¿verdad? Estamos bien. De acuerdo. En ese marco nosotros trabajamos fortaleciendo a grupos organizados, cooperativas mineras principalmente, del altiplano boliviano y dentro de la minería tradicional, prácticamente estaño, plata, plomo y zinc. No trabajamos en la minería del oro, que ahora tiene una particularidad muy grande. En ese marco nosotros hemos promovido el fortalecimiento y seguimos promoviendo el fortalecimiento y la capacidad de productiva, social, organizativa de las minerías de pequeña escala, las cooperativas mineras, y en ese marco hemos ido trabajando primero en la constitución, luego en la capacidad productiva que éstas tengan, y ahora estamos con mucho énfasis en el trabajo con las mujeres mineras. Hace 10 años muchas mujeres mineras han ingresado en este sector, muchas mujeres esposas de ex mineros que han fallecido, se han separado, han empezado a ingresar a trabajar en las minas con base en los derechos adquiridos de la sociedad cooperativa minera, ¿no? Hasta hace un poco más de 10 años la mina era privada a las mujeres por un concepto que se maneja en el altiplano boliviano que dice que cuando una mujer trabaja en minería, la beta mineral se pierde, ¿no? Es un concepto machista que hemos ido trabajando para que se vaya rompiendo y que las mujeres tengan acceso a la participación en las cooperativas, porque básicamente esto es un activo, ¿no? Un activo que, fruto de este machismo que ahí en las minas se le despojaba a las mujeres cuando el esposo fallecía principalmente, ¿no? No transmitían este activo financiero, que es la acción en la cooperativa, y no la transmitían a las esposas o a la familia de los mineros. Es así que trabajamos en el CICEP. También trabajamos muy brevemente, Peter, en juntas vecinales de la zona periurbana del municipio de Oruro, de la ciudad, porque es donde los trabajadores mineros vienen a residir cuando ya están dejando las operaciones mineras. Entonces fortalecemos en estos barrios que están alrededor de la ciudad para que puedan tener mejores condiciones de vida ya en la ciudad de Oruro.
Thank you. And you have already touched upon the issues of that there is cooperative mining in Bolivia. So can you tell us a bit more about what is the specific situation of tin cooperatives in Bolivia? And obviously, the interest, unfortunately, is always what are the main issues? What are the main human rights, labor rights issues that you see in tin cooperatives in Bolivia?
No me ha llegado la traducción, así que te comprendí muy poco. No nos están traduciendo.
Peter, he's saying that that wasn't being translated, so he didn't understand the question.
Okay. So could you, Jesus, could you tell us more about the situation in the cooperatives in Bolivia?
I can translate that one.
Bueno, para entendimiento, en Bolivia hay tres tipos de operadores mineros que se llamamos acá, ¿no? Primero está el Estado, el gobierno central, que tiene operaciones mineras, grandes operaciones mineras en estaño, y tiene una empresa fundidora, ¿no? Segundo está las empresas privadas, que tenemos dos tipos de empresas privadas, ¿no? La gran empresa privada, donde tenemos a una minera que produce oro, creo que es la tercera a nivel mundial, que está en Potosí, y varias que producen zinc principalmente, y estas están divididas en o son muy grandes o son muy chiquitas. Y la tercera es la minería cooperativizada, ¿no? Entonces, esos son los tres tipos de operaciones mineras que hay en Bolivia, y la mayoría se concentra en la parte alta de Bolivia, ¿no? Como ustedes sabrán, Bolivia tiene una zona que es un altiplano, una meseta, que va desde los 2.500 hasta los 4.000 metros, y luego están los llanos, donde la minería ahora está ingresando con mucha fuerza, principalmente con el oro. En ese marco, la minería cooperativizada en Bolivia se concentra en dos áreas, ¿no? La minería tradicional, la llamamos acá, que es estaño, plata, plomo, zinc, y la minería aurífera, ¿no? Que ahora por el boom de los minerales, de los precios minerales, tiene mucha importancia. Pero dentro de este contexto que les planteo, en términos de valor de producción, la minería privada produce cerca del 46% de toda la producción minera en Bolivia, mientras que las cooperativas producen el 47%. Entonces, el peso en valor de producción es muy grande, ¿no? En este tiempo, y el Estado produce alrededor del 7-8%. Entonces, esa es la escala de la minería, donde la minería del oro tiene también una importancia muy grande, ¿no? Actualmente, del 47 que les comento, a la mitad es en la minería del oro. Es en ese contexto que se mueve la minería en Bolivia y la cooperativa. En el caso del estaño, que es de lo que estamos hablando, de lo que hemos estado monitorizando, de ese pequeño, del porcentaje que les planteo, la Comibol, el Estado, produce cerca del 50% a través de dos empresas muy grandes, la empresa minera Guanuni y la empresa minera Colquiri, y el otro 50% las producen las cooperativas mineras. Para dar un ejemplo, en el año 2021, las exportaciones de estaño en Bolivia han generado 350 millones de dólares, ¿no? Y eso significa que las cooperativas han generado cerca de 175 millones de dólares en la actividad minera, ¿no? Algo bien importante para la comprensión es que la producción de las cooperativas mineras es a nivel de estaño mineralizado, del mineral de estaño, ¿no? Y por una ley nacional, todo el mineral de estaño tiene que ser exportado como estaño metalizado. Eso significa que deben fundirse todo el mineral de estaño en Bolivia. Y para ello tenemos a dos empresas en Bolivia, ¿no? Dos empresas, una estatal y una privada, que son las que compran todo el mineral que se produce. Eso significa que en Bolivia hay un oligopolio al momento de la compra del estaño, ¿no? Todas las productoras tienen que necesariamente vender a una de estas dos empresas fundidoras y eso las pone en una situación de ventaja. En Oruro, donde nosotros trabajamos, existen 17 cooperativas mineras que explotan estaño y de estas 3 están especializadas exclusivamente en estaño y las otras 14 producen de manera residual. Como les había dicho, hay 2 vías en las que las cooperativas pueden vender el estaño. Una es directamente a las fundidoras, que reciben volúmenes grandes, volúmenes constantes, ¿no? Y otra es a pequeñas empresas intermediarias que acá las llamamos acopiadoras de mineral, ¿no? Entonces, estas acopiadoras acumulan mineral de estaño principalmente de estas empresas de estas cooperativas que producen de una manera marginal, digámoslo así. Dentro de ese contexto, es importante comentarles que las cooperativas mineras en Bolivia no son dueñas de las operaciones mineras que están operando. Son arrendadas, son alquiladas al Estado boliviano, porque nuestra Constitución, a partir del año 2009, plantea que toda la riqueza del subsuelo es exclusividad del Estado, ¿no? Y en ese marco todas las operaciones mineras le pertenecen al Estado boliviano, excepto aquellas que previamente habían sido ya adquiridas por empresas privadas. Entonces las cooperativas mineras alquilan estas operaciones mineras que fueron desarrolladas por la Comibol, se llamaba la Corporación Minera de Bolivia, alquilan a un valor del 1% del valor bruto de producción, antes de descuentos y todo eso. Eso significa que las cooperativas mineras no tienen un activo fijo, ¿no? Y eso las pone en una desventaja muy grande. ¿Por qué? Porque al momento de querer invertir, ellos no tienen un activo fijo que les haga sujeto de crédito, ¿no? Y eso influye drásticamente en su trabajo, ¿no? Porque ustedes saben que en minería se requieren hacer grandes inversiones y estas grandes inversiones están enlazadas a la proyección de mineral que tiene la mina, ¿no? La beta mineral, ¿no? A las reservas mineralógicas. Y ellos no pueden acceder a estas reservas mineralógicas como propia para poder acceder a créditos que les permitan inversiones. Eso les limita su producción y por otra parte hace que trabajen en un mercado informal de crédito, ¿no? Pues al no tener esto y el riesgo es muy alto porque son minas agotadas ya del Estado central, van a adquirir la tecnología para su trabajo del mercado financiero informal, lo que implica un mayor costo de capital, un mayor costo de dinero y encarece su producción. Eso, digamos, es el contexto general de las minas cooperativizadas, Peter y compañeros.
Thank you for these very detailed run through. This is really very interesting because you have the oligopoly, you have the global supply chains, you have the global markets, you have the Bolivian state that is kind of owning the entire mining area. If you look at now the labor situation, the working conditions of miners, what are the main issues you see at cooperatives? What are the main problems that cooperatives have within the working conditions?
Bien. Nosotros hemos hecho una monitorización a una operación minera. Bueno, para que no vean solo mis rostros, voy a compartir algunas fotografías. Es una operación minera. Y en esta, por ejemplo, encontramos 3 problemas estructurales, ¿no? El primero es la flexibilización laboral, ¿no? La flexibilización laboral, ¿por qué? Porque hemos podido confirmar que el sistema cooperativo en Bolivia es un sistema de autoempleo. ¿Por qué? Porque según la legislación boliviana, en el sistema cooperativo general, y donde están amparadas las cooperativas mineras, no existe la relación empleado-empleador, ¿no? No hay una relación obrero-patronal. Por tanto, las cooperativas son básicamente un sistema de gestión de las obligaciones que tienen, principalmente las obligaciones sociales, ¿no? Que es el sistema de seguro de corto y largo plazo, o sea, la salud y las pensiones de la renta final que vamos a tener. Les comento que las fotografías que las estoy pasando, no estamos mostrando rostros de los mineros. Él es uno de nuestros técnicos que ha participado en estos procesos de caminar por las minas y saber qué está pasando. Por eso es el único rostro que van a ver ahí. Entonces, les decía, el principal problema es la flexibilización laboral. El minero, por una parte, él con los recursos de su trabajo, cubre las prestaciones laborales, las prestaciones del trabajo, y como ejemplo les vamos a decir que no existe una relación hora-trabajo, sino es trabajo-valor de producción. O sea, día que no trabajas, día que no produces y día que no se te paga, ¿no? Esto hace que principalmente las prestaciones sociales que en la legislación boliviana son asumidas por el patrón, por el empleador, que generalmente es del 33%. En el sistema cooperativo, este 33% del salario que debería ser aportado por el patrón, por las utilidades, es aportado por los ingresos del propio trabajador, ¿no? Eso significa que básicamente un 33%, un tercio de lo que los compradores están reduciendo, los compradores del mineral están reduciendo en un 33% los costos de producción de la mano de obra del minero, perdón, de la producción minera. Ese es el primer problema de fondo que hemos encontrado. Un segundo que ya les había comentado es la básicamente nula capacidad de inversión que tiene. Este, por ejemplo, es un acceso a una galería profunda, y si se fijan las gradas no tienen las condiciones, no tiene la pendiente, no tiene la señalización ni la protección necesaria, ¿no? Eso se da porque, como ya les había comentado, ellos operan en yacimientos alquilados. Este es un caso metalero, se llama, ¿no? Un caso en el que sale el metal y miren las condiciones en las que están, ¿no? Y no tienen acceso al sistema bancario, ¿no? No tienen acceso al sistema bancario porque no son sujetos de garantía, y hace que, como les había dicho, la flexibilización, la informalidad en los créditos sea la que impera, y por tanto los costos son muy, muy altos, ¿no? Por ejemplo, ¿eso qué impide? Fíjense en la imagen que les muestro, aquí hay una especie de triángulo. Esto ya es una galería minera que está siendo reforzada, y estos son maderas que están cediendo ante el peso de la carga de material que hay arriba, y hay un gran peligro a que esto se derrumbe, ¿no? Y eso es una de las condiciones que no pueden reparar porque requieren costos de inversión muy altos a los que no acceden. Y el tercer gran problema estructural, que diríamos nosotros, es el desconocimiento del mercado. Ellos consideran que el mercado se acaba con las fundidoras, o sea, no tienen noción más allá del mercado. Y eso es porque tanto las empresas fundidoras como estas otras empresas que acopian el mineral, les restringen, por así decirlo, el acceso, el conocimiento a otros, hacia más elementos en la cadena, ¿no? Porque hacen acuerdos, no son contratos, hacen acuerdos que les distraen demasiado, digamos, de poder averiguar qué hay más allá. Les voy a dar un ejemplo de esto. A principio de año ellos firman unos convenios con las empresas acopiadoras o con las fundidoras, y parte de estos convenios reciben, entre comillas, ciertos regalos. Por ejemplo, compresoras, reciben mangueras para la succión del aire y otros elementos que a ellos les es difícil invertir, ¿no? A cambio de firmar un acuerdo y darles exclusividad en la compra de este mineral, ¿no? Con ello ellos se distraen de acceder a averiguar los costos de producción externos, ¿no? Porque tanto las acopiadoras como las fundidoras también controlan el mercado de insumos, ¿no? Y entonces ellos simplemente van a tener ese elemento. Aquí esta palabra que dice acá, dice tojo, y todo este pedazo de roca que está en color plomo es un desprendimiento que se va a dar en algún momento, ¿no? Y el único elemento que ellos ponen de cuidado es poner tojo, ¿no? Eso quiere decir que es roca que se está desprendiendo, pero no hay ningún elemento que la desprenda o que la sujete para evitar un hecho futuro, ¿no? Eso es, Peter, digamos, los principales problemas. No sé si en este momento podemos hablar un poco más adelante, tal vez, de cómo va a afectar esto a las condiciones particulares del trabajo.
Thank you, Jesus. I think we are, I would like to ask you a last question, and would I like to ask you to rather briefly answer it, because we are almost reaching the 20 minutes mark. So I know that CSEP has developed a support system that you call LICMIN for the miners. You talked a bit about the miners actually not understanding or not having enough information about the market for the mineral that they have. So could you talk, give us a brief description of what this LICMIN system is about and how it is supporting miners and cooperatives in their work?
Gracias, Peter. Bueno, para redondear lo anterior, disculpas si me he extendido bastante. Todo lo que les había comentado hace un momento se traduce, por así decirlo, en algunos datos muy precisos que voy a plantear. Nosotros hemos levantado una serie de encuestas y hemos podido determinar en esta operación minera, que tiene alrededor de 200 trabajadores, que el 91% nos ha dicho que alguna vez ha trabajado los 7 días de la semana, ¿no? El 33% nos dice que trabaja habitualmente 10 horas, y el 16% que trabaja 12 horas a la semana, ¿no? El 83% nos indica que está expuesto a materiales peligrosos como el santato, el arsénico y otros tóxicos. Y el 58% nos dice que es consciente de que tiene algún estrés mental por el trabajo, por la presión que trabajar en condiciones de riesgo, ¿no? Y digamos, esos son cosas específicas que nos dicen lo dificultoso y lo difícil que es este trabajo. Pero yéndonos a lo que tú nos comentas, como CISEP hemos trabajado tanto en los procesos administrativos como también en procesos productivos, y nos hemos dado cuenta que pese a los esfuerzos que hagamos, los mineros pueden mejorar su capacidad de producción, pero esto se diluye en el momento de la transacción comercial, porque al estar cansados físicamente, al tener estrés y al tener una baja escolaridad, ellos no están en condiciones de hacer unos cálculos precisos para saber cuál es el valor de su mineral. Y en esa relación que tienen tanto con las fundidoras como con las empresas comercializadoras, ellos básicamente aceptan el valor de producción que les dicen estas dos actores de la cadena de suministros. Entonces nosotros nos hemos dado cuenta que ahí es un cuello de botella donde básicamente sufren engaño por parte de esto. Y hemos desarrollado una aplicación para celular y computadora que se llama LeakMe, que la pueden encontrar en Play Store, perdón por hacer propaganda, ¿no? Y es una aplicación donde ellos pueden, es una aplicación que nos presenta las fórmulas generalmente aceptadas para el cálculo del valor de mineral de estaño, plata, plomo y zinc, y que han sido hechas después de un estudio de cálculo de valor que tenemos en función a la normativa y a lo que operan las fundidores y el estaño, y podemos con esta aplicación que el minero compare la boleta de pago o de cálculo de valor que les ofrece tanto la comercializadora o la fundidora, y ellos puedan introducirle los datos y generar un valor similar. Perdón. ¿Sí? ¿Me decías? Bueno, continúo. Entonces, LeakMe es una aplicación para celular que puede comparar el valor, el cálculo del valor que hacen las operadores mineros, los comercializadores mineros y las fundidoras, y ellos, los mineros, puedan calcular también el valor de su mineral, de tal manera que les permita discutir y negociar un mayor precio del valor de su mineral. Con esta aplicación LeakMe hemos conseguido, por ejemplo, que en un promedio de entre el 2 y el 7% del valor que les ofrecen las comercializadoras se ha incrementado, ¿no? Y esto va a impactar directamente en sus ingresos. Con esta aplicación intentamos que el proceso de negociación de la compra-venta del valor del mineral rompa las asimetrías educativas y de acceso a información que puedan tener los mineros de las cooperativas con las empresas que les compran el mineral.
Thank you, Jesus. This was really, really, really very informative also for me, and I really like your approach to how to support miners by basically giving them the tools how they can at least try to change the difference in having an information and having tools that they can access so they can negotiate better prices. Thank you again for your input, and we will be continuing our work with CSEP. Electronics Watch is working with CSEP to monitor the tin mines in Bolivia. So now we saw the situation at one end of the global supply chains, and now let's jump to the other end. Let's jump to Malmö in Oslo. Malmö in Oslo, Malmö in Sweden, I mean. And so while the global supply chain in electronics and vehicles start in countries like Bolivia, final customers are often public buyers that procure the minerals in form of products, in form of vehicles, of ICT. And for some years now, public buyers have been working towards using their procurement leverage to improve the situation of workers, miners, and affected communities in the global south. And to see how this is kind of conceptualized and how this is tried to and how this is implemented, we invited Petra Walterova and Olof Kellgarn to present us on the Malmö roadmap towards ethical and climate smart procurement of electric vehicles, batteries. To introduce you, Petra will start, and Petra has worked for the International Trade Center's Trade for Sustainable Development program since 2014. Here she set up the Trade for Sustainable Development Hub in Nairobi in Kenya and managed the EU Cities for Fair and Ethical Trade Awards project since 2017. Prior to joining ITC, Petra worked on the trade policy issues at the World Trade Organization and has experience from the Czech administration, the private sector. She holds a master's degrees from Geneva and one from Prague on international economic relations as well as development studies. So Petra, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm just confirming whether you can actually see my screen.
We can see your screen, yes.
The presentation.
No, we see the presenter's perspective. Now we see a very beautiful picture of a steaming river.
Now you can see it, hopefully, the presentation.
Now we see the slides. Yes, thank you.
Okay. So, okay, hopefully now you can see it. So I will.
Now we see this presenter screen with the black background.
And we tried actually beforehand, so
yeah.
we were quite well prepared.
Now,
and it seemed to have worked.
Now we are right.
Very good, very good. So thank you very much, Peter and Elena, as well, for giving us the space to actually be here with Olaf Chalgan from the city of Malmö to present a very, briefly on the roadmap. I will only give a very short introduction of why I am here as well, and how ITC, the International Trade Center, even enters this picture, because the spotlight is really here on the city of Malmö as the procurer and the implementer of the roadmap that we'll be speaking about. But just very briefly, International Trade Center is a multilateral agency with a joint mandate from the World Trade Organization and the UN, where we really work on supporting. We have quite a unique mandate actually on supporting SMEs in developing countries in terms of plugging them into international value chains. Maybe some of you already know our work. Where I sit specifically, we actually do not work so much on public procurement as an agency, but my team, my program, that's what we call the Trade for Sustainable Development Program, or T4SD, has been working on voluntary sustainability standards and how they really plug, how they work in value chains and in many different sectors. We have been working on many different projects and programs around that, also from many sides, actually, from multiple perspectives, upstream, downstream, and value chains, mostly in agriculture and textiles and apparel so far. But this project with the city of Malmö also ushered us a little bit into a new space, and how that happened was through the two specific components of our program that we have been working on, one of which is the EU Cities for Fair and Ethical Trade Award, which was funded by the European Commission up until last year. There have been 2 editions of this award, which we implemented, but also our, I would say, flagship database, flagship platform that maps out sustainability standards, mostly of voluntary private nature, out there in the world globally. We currently have about 320 of these standards in the system, in the database. And then marrying these two together, it was really through the award that I mentioned, and where actually the Fair Trade Advocacy Office in Brussels was also a big partner in disseminating this award and the knowledge about it. It was won by the city of Malmö in 2020 and was the title holder the whole of last year, where we worked together also with other cities on really exploring how cities, what their role is in plugging in fair and ethical trade practices in multiple streams of their work. So public procurement was also one of the topics, obviously. And there the city of Malmö won this award, and part of their, let's say, the winning pitch was also a proposal for a project which they would implement had they have the mandate and the support, and also financial support from the EU later on, that would kind of explore new frontiers in this space. So for them, it was really to focus on more ethical procurement of batteries for e-vehicles as part of the net zero commitments that the city has made, and Olaf will obviously cover that in a much more elaborate terms. But that was really something that was viewed as quite really tackling a new frontier in this space by a city procurer, really by a public procurer that has a certain leverage, even though possibly a small one, but still just really taking this future-looking, forward-looking perspective was very alluring. And that's what we started. We essentially sat down together as the implementer of the award, the winning city, the EU, on the 3 sides of the table, and we decided to go for this award when Malmö won this. And we did this really with the mind that that ITC, that our team is that custodian or the trustee, let's say, of this database of standards that, again, some of you actually might know. So this is the standards map database. Here I put also the the URL to the database for some of you that might not know it or want to explore it a little bit further, but it really is an unprecedented in terms of its scope into what we can look, what standards are applicable in which sectors, the level of analysis that can be done, comparing of these standards, for instance, and just looking where they are. So we know that there is quite a bit of coverage in the mining sector, for instance, but we also, and when we made this conclusion through also looking into the risks, hotspots during the project with Malmö, and then later on in devising the roadmap, that there is really no such standard for a battery as such, obviously, or an e-vehicle, if you speak about it. So that was very interesting for us to actually, look at a little bit deeper and just even, doing this a little bit of an overview, of a comprehensive overview of what the standards are in this space applicable was actually quite interesting. And then the project really focused on, and this was more or less a Malmö project, but we very much also signed up for it, that we first mapped out the risk hotspots really throughout the value chains of vehicles, and then came up with the roadmap based on that. So it was a little bit, it was a really, let's say, well-informed process. It wasn't just looking at an issue from whichever angle, but there was a really good consideration. And we did this together with TDI Sustainability, who have been helping us on really developing both of those, what now are reports for the city of Malmö to use. But then also for us as ITC, we actually learned quite a bit on that, because again, we haven't really focused on ICT value chain or e-vehicle value chains and batteries specifically as much before. But inevitably, as we also support SMEs to be climate smart, climate competitive, and suppliers in many different value chains, we're kind of also tackling new frontiers when it comes to new value chains, looking at those projects there. This was very interesting just to take a look at, what standards are there, how they actually operate, and what we can bring as ITC to that. I will actually not maybe even speak too much about this, because I think now is the time to give the floor really to Olof to go into the depths and really all the angles of the roadmap. So maybe Olof, the floor is yours, unless there is really any question on specifically the sustainability or the standards map and the role of ITC in this.
I think we can take the questions at the end. So Olof, let me briefly introduce you before you jump into your presentation. So Olof is the coordinator of the Malmö Fair Trade City project in Sweden. He holds a Bachelor of Social Science and Environmental Science at Malmö University. And since 2017, he works as a project manager and coordinator at the Malmö Fair Trade City. In 2020, as already mentioned, Malmö won the EU Cities for Fair Trade Ethical Award. And this is what I really like. The Malmö's motto is, it should be easy to do the right thing. And he centers his work around this. So thank you, Olof, again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay. So, yes, let's start with a picture of myself. Just to introduce myself, you've already said it, I'm here in Malmö, Sweden, and we have worked since 2006 with the classic fair trade products, such as bananas and tea and coffee. And it's very interesting for me to hear from Jesus in Bolivia about the cooperatives being set up, and I mean, that's how the fair trade started, the progressive cooperatives, the coffee cooperatives, right? Where people came together and started to take back a bit of their power to not only give away their supplies to whatever price the market offered, but rather go together and take back some power. And maybe that's where this is heading as well now when we're speaking about minerals and batteries for electric vehicles. So why did Malmö pursue this topic about more fair and ethical batteries for vehicles? Well, you can see here in the graph that sales of e-vehicles is growing very fast, almost exponential. And we also know very little about the vehicles and the bikes that we buy. So in Malmö, we have around 1,000 vehicles that the municipality owns. We basically don't know where the batteries come from. We know very little about this. And that's a big problem for us, because as a fair trade city, we set out to have knowledge on this. And we also see it as important that we not only wait for information, but rather that we try to push the topic. Also, as many cities, we aim to be more climate smart, and we have the goal to be a net zero organization by 2030. So that means we also have to know what emissions do the e-vehicles that we buy produce. We don't know that now. Yeah, and in general, we cannot just make the switch to e-vehicles and e-bikes instead of internal combustion engines, because we're not going to solve anything unless we know what we're doing, right? So yeah, we're looking at both bikes with batteries in them and electric cars, because there's also the smart mobility thinking that some journeys can be replaced by a bike, by an electric bike, and then we don't even have to buy a whole car. So to try and tackle this issue, we set out with ITC and the EU Commission funding and TDI sustainability to create a risk report to inform ourselves a little bit about what problems are there really when we are buying this. We have the roadmap, which I'll talk more about now. We also have this communication phase, so it's part of this to also speak at venues like this and get feedback, and then we're working to integrate this roadmap into our procurement, which takes quite some time. We're really starting out here. And if you want to get the full roadmap, the purpose is that it can be used by other public buyers as well, even private ones. It's coming in its public version in June. So one conclusion from the project is that according to corporate human rights benchmark, which are assembling a lot of different benchmarks on human rights, the automotive sector, i.e. the car industry, has the lowest score ever. That could mean that they simply don't know where they are buying from, just that the transparency is so low. But we have to know more, and this is clear that it's a big problem. Then we looked a little bit deeper into this, and the 4 key risks that we see that we are also then trying to address in the roadmap is that there are high carbon emissions in the manufacturing of batteries. And this is very counterproductive, since the purpose of switching to e-vehicles is to be climate smart. Then we have child labor, very prominent, especially in cobalt mining. I'm sure you know this, but just to clarify what we base the roadmap on. Then transparency, like I said, it's very limited. Then at the end of the life, which is the less traditional fair trade approach, what happens to the batteries afterwards? So recycling right now is very low, and of course then drives more resource extraction unnecessarily. So I like to do this analogy here, that in 2006, when we started out as a fair trade city, we had 0.4% ethical coffee, 0.4%. Then it took us around 12 years to reach 99% in 2018. And the first year was quite quick, then it was a bit slower, but it was a long process. So the question we're asking now, is there an ethical vehicle battery? Can we just say, oh, we want a fair trade battery? Well, no, there is not such a thing. Definitely, there is nothing that is a certified ethical battery. And so maybe that's where we are now, 0.4%, or even before that. And this is where, again, ITC comes in with a very fantastic standards map website. I mean, it's a super comprehensive website. You can compare so many different standards depending on like what criteria do we have, and then we can compare that, see what standards fit our requirements. But unfortunately, batteries are not there yet, because like I said, there is no certifications. That's one of the goals in the long term as well, that the standards map can also contain. So if you search for battery here, I get no results, but in the future, we also aim that there should be standards there. Okay. So based on these risks, we have developed a roadmap, and it covers 4 strategic areas. So it's like a smorgasbord. It's like a big table of options you can choose from. You can pick to do just one thing, or you can do all 12 if you want. So the 4 strategic areas is based on this more classic one, where we would consider or incorporate requirements in our procurement. So, for example, asking the car brand, where is the minerals coming from? What smelters, refiners are we buying from? What GHG emissions is happening there? Where we're not asking this right now, but this is the goal that we need to start doing that. Then we have reduced unnecessary procurement. Like I said, there is no point in just buying e-vehicles and try and think that we are saving the climate. We have to know what we're purchasing. And at this state, when material extraction is so high, it makes many times much more sense to not buy a vehicle, but rather use it more smart, the ones that we have. Then we also set out to address the root causes, right? To speak more, not only speak to the car brands, but try to speak to alliances such as Fair Cobalt Alliance, Aluminium Stewardship, Responsible Mining Initiative, and be a little bit closer to where the supply is happening. And also try and understand, like, what can we do as a public procurer? Is this enough? Is this roadmap good? Then we have focus on recycling and reuse. So this is also something where we can do much more, right? We don't know what happens to the batteries after we have used them right now. So some examples here. There are 8 risk management measures. So based on the strategic areas, then there are these more detailed ones. So one would be to favor suppliers then that can minimize emissions in the battery manufacturing process, and require them to disclose information about supply chains. And then also we're looking at this number 4 here to set up car sharing instead of just buying vehicles. Rather that we could potentially share them with citizens, or that we can at least share much more within the municipality. So those are just some examples. Like I said, the full roadmap will be available in June. And then how to prioritize, right? So we have this smorgasbord, we have so many. These are some examples, but I want to try and make some points, at least in the Swedish perspective. Like, we're a small country. Malmö is a small city. We have 350,000 inhabitants. So we need to really have collaborations with Electronics Watch and with, for example, our national procurement specialists, ADA, they're called, so they can help us to follow up, because it's very rare that municipalities have time to follow up, to properly check really what the suppliers say is true. Also, we have ethical trading initiative in Sweden, where they are doing follow-up in Chinese battery factories, which we'll get results from in June. So it's very hard for us to do this ourselves, but we have to sort of try and take on the leading role and collaborate with others and see where can we get help, where can we push this issue. Yeah, I already said that. So just to conclude, we think this is super important, because the rates of sales are growing exponentially. It's just going to be more and more everywhere in the world. And with regards to human rights, again, the automotive sector is the worst performing ever. Then there is I missed to show you this slide here just quickly. So one interesting fact as well is that we compare the worst and the best case scenario for production in a country with a lot of coal in their energy mix. We have very high emissions when producing batteries. In Sweden, we have much less of carbon intensity in our electricity. So it's a 5-time difference here between where the battery is produced. So sorry, back to my conclusion here. So that's point number 3. It's a 5-time difference. Despite all these problems, very many buyers have very mild criteria. They just set out to say, oh, let's be climate smart, we buy e-vehicles, but that's not enough. And long term, we need third-party certification, really, because it's very chaotic right now. It's very hard for us to get answers. It's very hard for the suppliers to answer us correctly. They have thousands of municipalities asking them the same things. And one final point then is that every buyer can do something, right? We hadn't done anything before this, really. Despite us being a fair trade city, we want to be a net zero city, right? But we have to try and look at this together and do both the climate thing and the ethical smart thing at the same time, and start doing something. And that's where the roadmap comes in. And I hope it can be useful to you here as well. So here is a link where you can sign up to get a newsletter where the final roadmap will be published. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Olof. And I really like this idea that the roadmap is for anybody to use, because I guess it was a lot of work to develop it, and people don't have to redevelop the roadmap again and again. We can just use the ideas you have already developed. And you mentioned this already a lot of in this field is about public buyers really following up. So having on their own purchasing practices that make sense and that are supportive, but setting up also criteria and contract conditions that are actually pushing for this in the supply chain. And they need to follow up. It is about control, it is about monitoring, it is about engagement with the supply chain, and about cooperating with the industry to push for really improvements. And you mentioned Electronics Watch already a bit. We just have started the low emission vehicle program to really work on this too, with organizations like Barcelona, London, Oslo or Hamburg. So if there is any public buyer that wants to also look into how to procure vehicles on a more sustainable fashion, do contact also Electronics Watch, do contact Olof at Malmö. There is a lot of need to collaborate and to learn and to exchange, because this is a really new field. And with this, I want to throw the ball over to Elena for the last part of our webinar.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, and speaking of new fields, we will jump into the topic of due diligence a bit deeper in relation to purchasing practices with our next speaker, Ben van Pepperstraete. That is speaking to us with his Tradecraft Exchange head, where he's working on purchasing practices. He has a background on the intersection between labor rights, human rights due diligence, and international trade, with a focus on the clothing sector. So comes with the expertise from the development of the concept of due diligence, but also from the importance of purchasing practices and how to connect the two. So this is really, yeah, a good opportunity to hear more about that. And Ben, can I ask you to start with a brief update of where we stand with the latest proposal by the Commission? So as we heard in previous webinars, we have this proposal by the Commission for sustainable, for corporate sustainability due diligence. And yes, just briefly, since you're also working on this.
Yes, thank you very much, Elena. And first and foremost, also a very big thanks to the organizers for again convening a very interesting webinar. But to your question, where are we with the proposal for corporate sustainable due diligence directive? I think the good news is that the proposal since a couple of months is out in the public. So that was, well, it doesn't seem much to say it, but it's a very important first step, and it's at least a year later than initially anticipated. So it was very much a complex delivery for the Commission to come up with the proposal, and for those who have read the proposal in much more detail may also see a bit that it took the Commission quite a lot of internal debate and discussions and also compromises, hence also some stranger elements into the proposal to deliver this to the world. But first and foremost, it's out on the world since a couple of months, so that's very good news. And so, like with any Commission proposal, it now goes to the two co-legislators. So those are the European Council, where we find all the European member states, and on the other hand, the Parliament. And so now it's up to those two institutions to develop their own opinion about what's going on. And that process is not yet in full steam. In Parliament, there's a lot of people who are very interested in the proposal, and that's also not surprisingly, because it's a horizontal regulation, so it touches on a lot of human rights. It touches about environmental rights. It needs to be cross-sectoral, so it covers a lot of different sectors, ranging from food to electronics to textiles to cars to IT. So lots of people have an opinion about that in Parliament. So that's them trying to seek which committee is competent or at least has the right to say an opinion. And similar in the Council, all these member states are trying to find an opinion on what they think about this. And also there we see that lots of member states are in unequal footing. So for example, on one hand, you have member states that have a law, like the French Loi de Vigilance and the German Lieferkettengesetz. You've got a couple of member states, also the Netherlands should be counted, because they do have one on child labor due diligence, and they do have a proposal as well. There's a couple of other member states with a proposal. But then on the other side of the spectrum, you also have member states who don't even have a national action plan on business and human rights. So it's, at least for me, a mystery what they think about business and human rights, but also probably for them, it's still a mystery what they themselves as a member state think about this specific topic. So yeah, I hope that gives an answer on where we are. The proposal is out, and now the co-legislators are slowly starting to get their negotiating mandates in order, but that's going to be a slow process given the complexity of the topic, but also the complexity of the proposal.
Yeah, thank you. That's a yeah, it helps clarify where we stand. And yeah, as you said, it will take a while. So we're looking at about 2 years of shaping probably. So what we're talking about now is what we can see now, but we of course continue working on trying to improve the provisions to make them as effective as possible. And a part of that is also purchasing practices. We have mentioned in previous webinars, but maybe just to cover, public authorities will not be covered by this legislation, but there was a proposal to have them in it, but then it would require a revision of different set of directives. So this might come into play with the next commission in again, about 2 years or so. But it's still relevant to think about it because it's an important process of assessing exactly also what we heard in previous presentations of impacts of the risk assessment of impacts public institution could have through their public procurement. And I already introduced a little bit why we're talking about purchasing practices, but Ben, could you maybe take us a bit deeper into how purchasing practices interplay with the due diligence process and why it is so important that they're included and how?
Yes, no, of course, this is a crucial question because it's often through purchasing practices that you can actually that so-called lead firms are actually linked with human rights abuses that occur somewhere in their value chain. So simply put, there is the lead firm who often is having market power. And that's something that we see in textile, but we equally see that in agriculture. We also see that in electronics. The discrete modalities might differ a bit, but in general, it's the name brand, whether you call it H&M, Nestle, or Apple, that has the power, sets the tone, sets the specifications of the product, sets the lead times, determines the lead times, and also to a large extent, because they have several buyers to look at, also has a big influence on the prices. Every sector may have its own dynamics of seasonality. So, for example, H&M in the textile industry works with 45 micro seasons. But the same with an Apple, who once it launches a new version of the iPhone, sees that iPhone within 3 days in lots of countries to be marketed and gets a lot of its sales actually in the first month after launch. So also there, you see the enormous control on the timing that such a company has. And so the extent is, and then the question is, what is the planning and the forecasting that such a company does towards its suppliers? Because if you make these amendments on orders, either on volume or on the timing, relatively ahead, a company can plan. But what often happens is that these orders get amended quite on a short notice. This product is much more successful. We can't have empty stores, so we're just going to order a bit more, which then, for example, results into the producing facility that needs to buy, whether it's clothing. It's a bit more trickier, for example, in agriculture, because you can't spontaneously make new pineapples. But anyway, the facility is then prompted to actually deliver much more with the same production capacity. And so a production facility is then also going to look at how can I make this work, and where can I cut the prices, and often that's not really possible on the raw materials, because the inputs for a supplier, whether it's semiconductors, whether it's fabric, etc., will remain the same or sometimes even go up. These are really bizarre times when it comes to sourcing raw materials. So then the other dimension that is left to manipulate is the workforce. And that's how then these purchasing practices of the lead firm, and then the constant or the increase of the raw material input upstream, sort of like pressure the supplier to then look at, okay, wages, but also the type of contracts, from fixed duration contracts to short-term contracts, anti-union movement, because once you have a union, wages will also go up. They will ask occupational health and safety is also something where often corners are cut in various ways. In the garment industry in South Asia, that was on fire and building safety with the result of burning buildings and collapsing buildings. But in Southeast Asia, it's on issues like ventilation. So you've got work temperatures of 35 degrees, which are impossible to have semi-industrial work. But in the electronics sector, it's protection against chemicals, for example, that gets then sacrificed. And then finally, also the most logical one is work times. You get forced overtime as a result of poor planning and lead terms. So of course, once looking through the lens of purchasing practices, it's logical that this is one of the most effective ways to start actually regulating how lead firms are connected to human rights abuses, how they can be stopped as well. So if you can convince by regulation, for example, to companies to start paying their suppliers on time, start paying a correct price, which is above the cost of production, also give a bit more margin and breathing room to those suppliers. In that sense, electronic suppliers and garment suppliers are sort of in the same boat, because the margins that we're talking about are 2 to 5%, which are razor thin. If they get a bit more oxygen, then there's also a bit more oxygen at the side of suppliers to talk about wage increases to come closer to what could be considered a living wage. So tackling purchasing practices is crucial, and it's important that this happens at an industry level or an economy level, and not brand or lead firm by lead firm. So in that sense, if you want to tackle human rights abuses, makes a logical choice. It's surprising that in the current proposal for corporate sustainable due diligence directive, purchasing practices take a relatively marginal role. There is some recognition to the problem when you look at the recitals, which are preambular and give a bit of context to the operating paragraphs. But when you then actually look to the heart or the engine or the belly of the beast, when it comes to the articles which really deal with preventing human rights abuses and stopping human rights abuses, all of a sudden the references to purchasing practices become much more mysterious. You can, if you're a wild optimist, maybe read into it, but if you are, I would say, a pessimist or even a realist, there are reasonably not really an obligation upon the company to amend their purchasing practices in such a way that they would not contribute to human rights abuses. On the contrary, even the proposal even builds in, because it builds very much from a contractualization of contractualization approach. So it forces companies to get into contracts with its suppliers and even its sub-suppliers. But it also puts again the responsibility back on the supplier to deal with the compliance costs, which then is no longer giving that breathing space, but is actually adding a new cost for compliance on that supplier without necessarily giving sufficient financial or other support to those suppliers to make that cost of compliance or the respect of human rights, because cost of compliance is a relatively more technocratic managerial approach. But even if you want to use that term, the cost of compliance currently is not necessarily financed. There is no obligation for the lead firm to finance or to make sure it's feasible for their supplier to respect human rights. And that's a missed opportunity, to say the least, if not rendering the proposal relatively doubtful to its effectiveness in actually preventing and addressing human rights impacts in supply chain.
Thanks. This was a very comprehensive background on why this is an essential topic to address within due diligence. And I also see some connections to what public authorities can already be doing in existing practices, right? Also from the focus on prices versus quality to also other conditions that could enable better planning to suppliers and their suppliers. But in the meantime, also because I see there's a question on the point that the public procurement element was excluded from the final draft. Could you maybe explain what was the reasoning behind it and how come it's not a factor as for example, in the German legislation?
Yes, so of course, I'm partially speculating because I don't work for the European Commission, so I cannot read into the minds and the wisdom of the European Commission in separating it, but I do want to point out that there is already an instrument, a directive that regulates public procurement that was actually adopted into the last mandate. And in the last mandate, it indeed started, it gave more space to ethical considerations in the public procurement, in the different stages of public procurement, from the tendering to the actual contracting. So that was a good improvement. But as equally been noted, I think it was on a webinar here by Olga from Greenwich University. It is not really compatible with the more dynamic nature of human rights due diligence. So indeed, an update is required. And my thinking is indeed that, or my guesstimate is that the Commission thought it was going to be relatively difficult to do both at the same time. So why not do regulate the private sector in this mandate and then give an update to the directive on public procurement in the next mandate in order to make that fit for purpose again, at least from a human rights perspective. I think the other thing is that the dynamics are slightly different. The whole idea behind public procurement directive is also to make sure that public procurement is done in that this also prevents politicians, for example, to award public contracts to their best friends and only to their best friends. And so there are a number of guarantees built in there, which do make it slightly more complex to really deploy the dynamic. More complex, but not impossible, certainly feasible. But it's just something that needs to be thought through on how then that more dynamic nature of human rights due diligence fits very well in. And so I think they just thought, let's revamp that instrument to make it fit for purpose rather than coming up with conflicting obligations up to all kinds of governments, ranging from national governments to local governments.
Thank you for clarifying. I would then refer back to Peter for the Q&A.
Thank you, Elena, and thank you, Ben. This was really, again, very informative. So I've learned a lot. Just before we dive into Q&A, if you have not monitored your chat, which is understandable because you want to listen to the presentation, there are really three great things happening in the chat. So Mai Trueba posted 2 links to her research papers on the labor rights issues in the mining cooperatives in Potosí in Bolivia. That is really interesting. I have not yet checked them out. So Olaf has also posted a link to the newsletter, so you can sign up and get your public version of the roadmap. And then also Jesus has posted the link to the Lickman app, so you can actually download it only if you are on the one and not the other platform. So that's one thing. Elena also asked a question that was posted. There is some Spanish discussion going on. I can't really understand what this is, but there is another question from Richard Jones, and I don't really know who will be the expert here to answer this. So please just jump in. So his question is on the proposed social taxonomy for sustainable finance, and he's asking whether this could positively impact human rights for workers, for miners, whether this is health and safety or fair wages. Do you have any perspective on this? Ben, you unmuted yourself, so please.
Oh, did I?
Well, if you didn't, then I just, yeah.
No, but I can give one element on this. I think on the one hand, it is good that the S of ESG is getting a bit more meat on the bones, because that has always been a bit, the social part has always been a bit most difficult ones to quantify. And has in that sense getting received less attention than the E and the G in ESG. So it's a good step forward in that sense. At the same time, I think we run quite quickly into conceptual issues on how to quantify the social. How can you quantify something like freedom of association? Because the moment that you start asking facilities, do you have a union, and it becomes a quantifiable answer, the facility tends to say, sure, we have one. It doesn't really matter whether it's like we can make one. Yeah. So at that moment in time, it's no longer independent or democratic, etc. And so at that moment in time, it also risks quite quickly to become a pitfall, because then facilities that are reported to have a union, although it might be a yellow union, get actually more access to specific financial incentives, which is actually the opposite of what we try to achieve. So the proof is really into the eating is really into the pudding. No, the proof of the pudding is really in the eating. Sorry, that was trying to mix Dutch and English in a proverb. I think here we still need to eat it before we can really say what it is.
Okay, but I think that's a very good point. Measurability is sometimes basically not allowing to really see what is happening on the ground in the factories, in the mines. So we have 4 minutes left. If there is a question any one of you would like to bring up, please just unmute yourself and ask away. If not, I will just wait a second. Or you can also put on the raise hand or use the raise hand function. There seems to be no further questions. Okay. Well, first, let me thank you, all of the speakers, all of the panelists. It was really very, very insightful for me. I hope it was as well insightful for the listeners. This is always the negative part about webinars. We can't see your faces, so we don't see what your reaction is. In a real workshop or webinar, we would have actually seen if you are bored, if you are playing with your smartphone, or if you are really very much listening. But again, thank you for all the panels. Thank you for everybody that has participated. Let me share my screen a last time because I mentioned that that this is a 6-part series. We are now in part 5. So there will be a 6th part, and this will be about the support for public buyers to implement human rights and environmental due diligence. We have not yet set a date for this, but please do look out. We will be announcing it through all the channels of Fair Trade Advocacy Office, of IndustriALL, and of Electronics Watch. Thank you again for participating. Thank you to all the panelists. And as I mentioned in the beginning, this this session will be also uploaded to the internet in the coming time, so you can rewatch it or share it with others. And with this, I would end the panel. And Thank you. Have a nice day to Jesus and everybody in Bolivia, and have a nice afternoon to everybody in Europe, and have a nice evening to everybody in Asia. Thank you.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.